Hello, everybody. And while we're waiting for people to file in, this is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association in New York. And today we're venturing into one of the world's sort of hottest hotspots, the Caucasus. And we have to disambiguate here is that the Caucasus is no relation to the Caucasus, and the Caucasians have no relation to the ethnic category on the southern states ethnicity lists. So we're talking in particular today about Armenia and Georgia, which are tied in closely to Russian ambitions in the area, and also to Azerbaijan, which is a sort of sometimes slight rival. But we were discussing earlier about this. It's very easy for us to think of binary politics, to say there's one side and then another side, and that so-and-so is pro-Western or pro-Russian, when mostly the politicians involved are pro themselves, which is a theme that I think Tom Doval is going to pick up on, especially in the case of the Georgian Dream, which is regularly described as pro-Russian when it's only expediently so. I was in Georgia and nobody wanted to run a Russian language program, which I said was essential. I was trying to persuade them was essential to get over the neighbors who did actually communicate in Russian. And most people in Georgia communicate in Russian, but they don't want to be seen speaking it. Nationalism has some strange aberrations. Well, not strange, understandable under the circumstances. So I think we should get in here. There's been a peace treaty very recently, not a peace treaty, but a peace accord between Azerbaijan and Armenia and Artsakh, the former Nagorno-Karabakh. And we have to remember that Stalin, in his infinite wisdom as the Leninist theoretician on nationalities, I think he must have spent a lot of time when he was a child playing jigsaws, because he always has these little bits he leaves off the map. There's enclaves, exclaves, disconnected. There's even penclaves. I've been studying up on these lately. So there are all these anomalies, a bit like the Holy Roman Empire, with bits of disconnected land, technically part of it. If you were a cynic, you could say that Joseph Stalin was doing this to cause trouble and make sure they didn't get together against him. It could be that he was following the dictates of some weird ethnic algorithm. But in this case, I think, could we start with you, Tom? Because you are I think, and I don't think Tinatin disagrees with you too much. You were in effect saying that it's a mischaracterization to say that the Georgian Dream is pro-Russian.
So, yes, hello everybody. Thank you, Ian. Good to see you, Tinatin. Yeah, lots to talk about. Yeah, lots going on. I think Georgia is obviously probably at the forefront of our minds at the moment because you've got these mass protests on the streets of Tbilisi against this so-called foreign agents law, which was dropped last year and has been revived by the Georgian Dream government. I'm sure Armenia and Azerbaijan will, catch our attention soon because actually, to correct you, Ian, they've been negotiating, but they haven't agreed a peace treaty, so there's just as much chance that they could sign a deal as that they can slip back into conflict. Azerbaijan really has all the cards there. It's very much Azerbaijan's say-so what happens there. The Russian role has changed in the Caucasus. I think the Russians, since the invasion of Ukraine, have become a bit more pragmatic in the Caucasus with the withdrawal of the peacekeepers from Karabakh. Was the first in September last year was the first time that we've seen a Russian peacekeeping force actually wound up in the post-Soviet space. I think that's a sign that everything is devoted to Ukraine. It wasn't just about transferring those thousands of men and hundreds of armored vehicles from the Caucasus to Ukraine. It was also about a change of priorities, I think, for Russia, with looking for partners in the Caucasus. And Azerbaijan, I think, is now their chief partner in the Caucasus for economic reasons. We can come back to that. But Georgia is a very strange one. Tinatin will have a lot to say. Clearly, we have, I think, I would characterize it as the weirdest government in the post-Soviet space in Georgia. It doesn't really fit any category. It's the Georgian dream was founded and is still headed. He comes and goes. He's a bit of a reclusive figure by this extraordinary character, Georgia's richest man, Bidzina Ivanishvili, who made his money in Russia in the 1990s, then got out, then lay low for many years, suddenly made this in 2010, suddenly made this entry into politics, and basically his party steamrolled the elections in 2012 and has been in charge ever since. And the big question is really what they want. And there are many different signals, but they seem to kind of want everything. I would characterize it as they want power, they want to stay in power. There's an election coming up in October. They want to preserve their power, and they're also, I would also argue that unfortunately, the chief characteristic of Ivanishvili now and his party more generally is paranoia. He's, I think, been persuaded that the West is out to get him, that the West is plotting a Maidan in Georgia and using all these non-governmental organizations as their tools. He's pretty much got electoral politics sewn up. I think the party politics is very weak in Georgia, but these NGOs, particularly anti-corruption, election reform, election monitoring, independent media NGOs have been extremely effective in Georgia. And of course, Georgia's a low-income country. They're basically foreign funded. So I think they've hit on this idea that the way to close the space, win the election, and defeat this potential Maidan is to pass this very restrictive foreign agents law in Georgia. And many implications of that. One is obviously burning bridges with the West big time, even though Georgia has been offered EU candidate status. And the other thing is this kind of alignment with Russia. I wouldn't put it any stronger than that. The Russians clearly look favorably on this, but I don't think we're going to see Georgian Dream commit itself to abandon Europe altogether and sign up with any Russian organizations. I think they're just navigating this space, trying to win some favors in Russia, but still keep Russia at a bit of a distance. But I think I think this is really mainly, and it always is the case, all politics is local, is mainly about Georgian domestic politics.
So we're talking about emulation of Russian political methodology rather than admiration for Russian culture and
I think
in the Russian space.
Russian inspired, I think, is a good phrase. Not Russian instructed, but Russian inspired, I would say.
Tinatin, how do you feel on this?
Well, first of all, it's great to be back with you, Ian, and it's an honor to be here with Tom. I completely agree with Tom on a lot of the points that he made. And I think one thing that we need to bear in mind when we think about the Russian influence is precisely as Tom said, this is overall a Russian-inspired move, and in some ways a Russian-inspired government. In terms of the grip on power that Russia has, I think the Georgian Dream really looks up to that, and they wish they had that, but also I think they want to be a little bit of Turkey themselves, or have wanted to be a little bit of Turkey in terms of trying to maintain this multi-vectored foreign policy and be able to occupy 2 seats at the same time. At times they've been very successful at this, and I think now they are not. And in many ways, this is, to a degree, Ivanishvili's, but also the broader Georgian Dream's lack of an accurate read on how the population actually feels. I think they had a great read Ivanishvili certainly did in 2010, 2011, when he came in and he saw an opening and he jumped on it. And now he has been sitting in his ivory tower for so long that I think he really has lost touch with what's actually happening in the country, not just in Tbilisi, but in the periphery as well, in the various regions and other very significant cities and towns throughout Georgia. It's not just Tbilisi. And he has very much lost touch with that. And we're seeing that now. And I think the longer he continues to go against the will of the people, a significant part of the population, not all, of course, but a significant one that actually matters, ones that will go out there and ones that will show resistance, that is not a great look for him. And that rift between the government, the ruling party, or the regime, I should say, really, and the Georgian population, at least in terms of the population that we see in the streets right now, that rift will continue to deepen, and that will be a very bad look for Ivanishvili. I think the counter manifestation that he held on Monday was really a very bad look for him. Aside from the fact that, of course, the applause was pre-recorded, as were many people who were bussed in, and it was very clear that many had no idea why they were even there. Some thought that they were genuinely there because they were opposing the bill. So it's very concerning. It's actually not funny. It's come to the point where you don't really know whether to laugh or to cry. And in my case, this is more of a reason for me to despair, given the fact that I not only follow Georgia very closely as an analyst here at Eurasia Group, but also it's a country that I hail from, that I care about very deeply. And seeing what is happening in my own country, on the one hand, is extremely disturbing. On the other hand, I am, without sounding cliche, I'm very deeply inspired by the relentlessness of the youth. The youth movement is what caught many by surprise, including those of us who wish that we had been out there, maybe 5 years ago. It's come to the point where this generation, that I think is in many ways going to be the future of the country, is now starting to stand up for what they believe is right, and something that their parents, let alone their grandparents, who grew up very much under the Soviet occupation, even if they thought a certain way, they were either too afraid or perhaps too passive for them to actually go out and vote against the Georgian dream, even if in their own kitchens and the privacy of their own living rooms, sitting on a couch in front of the TV, they would actually be very vocal and very anti-GD. And yet the same people would go out there and cast another vote in GD's favor. So I think we're seeing a bit of an interesting situation, of course, but a disturbing one, because in the midst of all of this, Ian, you said that this is a binary system vis-a-vis Georgia, as there is one vis-a-vis the United States. But actually, there's this third part of the component that, in my opinion, is the weakest link in all of this, and that is the opposition. Not because the opposition is not trying to stand up for what's right, but this lack of an actual consensus within the opposition of what is it that the opposition can offer to the people, aside from them trying to vote out the current system and the current ruling regime. There isn't much there, really, in terms of a program, let alone the fact that they have failed time and again, unfortunately, to not only form a coalition, but to be able to actually identify and stand behind a single leader. And Georgia is the kind of country, as in many countries, of course, but Georgia being small and very impressionable, they do need to see that one person, and they will rally against that one person. Right now, they're rallying not against, sorry, together with that person. But right now, what we're seeing is that they are rallying around a European idea, but there isn't actually a candidate come tomorrow, the 26th of October, that people could go and vote for. So until the opposition can get their act together, it's going to be difficult for us to monetize, not in a financial sense, but in terms of votes, what we're seeing and the results of what we're seeing, for the opposition to be able to truly reap the benefits of a destabilized Georgian dream. I think it's a little too early for us to necessarily cross off the Georgian dream off of the political map in Georgia and to say that that's it, they're getting voted out. There needs to be an alternative beyond just a European idea and a European dream, which is certainly a lot stronger right now than what the Georgian dream is able to offer, which is a little bit of a nightmare, really.
Well, you apologize. I think that we all have much to apologize about our homelands at the moment and the way they're behaving. One of the characteristics in Britain and America and many others is the absence of, let's say, put it kindly, a charismatic opposition that will attract people, that's got ideas to go for. But the one thing as we were speaking, it strikes as a common thread. One of the things that makes Putin and the Russians attractive is his particularly reactionary line of sexual politics and the homeland, and his war on what was it from the Peter Sellers called them the preverts. And he didn't call them that, but in Dr. Strangelove, who the war on them seems to get the people out in the villages in Georgia, as in Georgia, US, as in Georgia, Caucasus. So it's this peculiar international resonance of sexual politics being used as an expedient to rally the traditionalists. And attached, I mean, who'd have thunk that Republicans would be demonstrating in favor of a Russian leader because they agree with his sexual politics, amongst other things. We are living in strange times. And where are we going to go from here? I mean, is there any sign of a viable opposition, built on any social or political basis, or even a nationalist basis in the Caucasus? Tom, what's
Well, let's pick up on your, I think, very important point about the sexual politics and the culture war. I think what Georgian Dream, when it came into office 2012 in European Parliament, aligned itself with the centre left, the Social Democrat group in Parliament. Last year, it switched to the far right group. So this tells you how weird it is to try and put a left-right kind of format on politics in the post-Soviet space or in Georgia. They talk about workers' rights, but actually, when it comes to cultural, social, sexual issues, they have suddenly discovered the electoral success of cultural conservatism. So that they have a natural ally there in most of the Georgian Orthodox Church, this kind of family values agenda. They're simultaneously trying to get an anti-LGBT law through Parliament. And for 2 years running, two different prime ministers, but very similar personalities, same policies, Georgian prime ministers have gone to the CPAC meeting in Hungary, attended by people from the American far right, Le Pen type people. Orban is the host, and there they've learned the vocabulary of I think this year it was called woke busters. The war on woke. That this is actually the most important thing in the world is to attack this so-called woke agenda, which no one's ever actually managed to define properly, but it's obviously a very useful
all the more
bogeyman.
powerful for being non-definable?
Exactly, and obviously they have inspiration from Putin, from Orban, but also from, of course, Donald Trump. And I'm afraid this is again one of the legacies of Trump, which unfortunately, as we know, could be more than just a legacy come the US elections in November.
Tinatin?
That's very true, actually, and that's one of the concerns when Georgia talks about, or the Georgian Dream rather, talks about the Ukrainization of Georgia and their fear that they were trying to instill in the population, of potentially opening the West, trying to open a second front in Georgia. What we should be talking about rather is this urbanization of Georgia on the one hand, and less so, I think, of a Russification. And in terms of what Tom was saying earlier, I think it's really important for us to understand that to a degree, both sides, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, but both sides, including the opposition coalition, they do need to play up the Russia connection to all of this, right? Because that is one of the triggers, the LGBTQ or the LGBT law that the Georgian Dream brought out as a way of sort of testing the waters before the foreign agent law was brought back. They knew that concept of something that appeals to a very conservative majority of the population, that would fly. So they felt that, you know, if that were to fly, then maybe now is the time for us just to probe this foreign agent law one more time. That is, of course, not the only reason of this very peculiar and partly, I would say, illogical timing of reviving that law. But what we're also seeing with the opposition trying to push back against this and call all of these efforts pro-Kremlin, and to a degree also not just a Kremlin-inspired, but actually a Kremlin-dictated move or two. And that is going to trigger some very serious, mildly speaking, discomfort, not only among those that are opposition friendly or opposition leaning, but also those that have been undecided voters for quite a while. There are many, I think, that both sides will need to tap into closer to the election. I would say really starting yesterday, where they would have to actually try to appeal those undecided voters, some that no longer appreciate what the Georgian Dream is and what it's become, and others who are not quite ready to vote for the opposition because of the various reasons that I described earlier, but mostly due to this lack of them not really having any sort of a coalition that they have formed and no charismatic leader as such. So those undecided, that undecided sliver of the population is going to be very, very easy for the opposition to trigger when they talk about anti-Russian or pro-Russian anything, really, because once they hear the word Russia, they immediately associate it with the Kremlin and Putin, but also many within that group lived through the Soviet occupation of Georgia during the Soviet times, pre-collapse, and therefore it brings back a lot of memories that are still very vivid in their imagination, in their living memory.
We also have the issue of the enclaves that's common to both Armenia and Azerbaijan and Georgia. They don't seem to be present in the discourse. I mean, these crowds aren't saying, bring us back Abkhazia. They're not saying, bring us back Ossetia. And even in Armenia, they're upset about Nagorno-Karabakh, but it doesn't seem to be the core issue in many ways. Has it been sidelined completely, or is it just waiting to come back with renewed force as an issue?
I think this is an interesting one. I think you know, it depends how you do the polling. If you ask people what their top issues are, they would across the Caucasus they would usually say things like unemployment, poverty, healthcare. But if you ask them, you know, how important is it to you to recover our lost territories, then suddenly you get high figures as well. So it can be a trigger. I think most Georgians, you know, I think are fairly realistic about the fact that these Abkhazia and South Ossetia have been lost for 30 years. Since 2008, they've been recognized by Russia, and there's no easy way of getting them back. And indeed, what would you do if you did get them back? You would have these minority populations who don't even speak Georgian. So, you know, it's a big ask. Armenia, it's obviously much fresher. The Armenia lost Karabakh only last September. The entire population fled. So that's still a very raw wound. But I think Armenia is just, in a sense, living day to day. They've been through a series of traumas, a kind of positive upheaval in 2018 when they had this peaceful revolution. Then in 2020, this disastrous war with Azerbaijan, lots of miscalculations there. And then 2023, the loss of Karabakh. And Azerbaijan doesn't seem to be giving up, seems to be still pressing them. And so when you talk to Armenians, they're worried about the fate of Armenia itself. They're still worried that there could be more military action by Azerbaijan on Armenia itself. So in that sense, Karabakh has kind of receded into the background, simply because, as Azerbaijan, I mean, this is really the big story of the last few years in South Caucasus. Azerbaijan has kind of emerged as the kind of hegemon in the region. Not only the 2020 war, but also Ukraine has massively strengthened. The Ukraine war has massively strengthened Azerbaijan. I was giving a lecture the other day and I showed 3 slides. One was June 2021, President Aliyev signing a treaty with President Erdogan of Turkey, a very strong alliance there. February 2022, just before the Ukraine invasion, he signs a partnership agreement in Moscow with Mr. Putin. And then the third slide is July 2022. He's signing a gas deal with Ursula von der Leyen from the European Commission. So he's, that's the example of a very successful multi-vector policy, which is, which is good news for Azerbaijanis, but not such good news for Armenians.
He's pursuing, if you remember, it's going back. I've got to remember that not everybody is as old as I, but the Cambodians under Prince Sihanouk, who had a balancing act in the middle of all of these different parties, which didn't end well, as I remember. But in the case of Azerbaijan, they have the guns, they have the money, and they have some serious support. So they're in a much stronger position. And you mentioned Erdogan there. Where is Turkey in all of this? Because the Turks are a bit of a, how should we say, an 8-ball rocketing around the board.
Shall I take that one, Ian? I'm sure
Yes,
Tinatin will
please.
have something to say. I mean, I think Turkey is another obviously winner from the war in Ukraine. It's managed to sort of play all sides quite effectively. It's got this massive economic boost. Russian gas still flowing in. Russian trade, massive. Istanbul airport is now the hub for all Russian flights. Russian money flowing into Turkey. At the same time, they're sending arms to Ukraine, and they've managed to block the straits and sort of turn the Black Sea into their own kind of backwater, because they're not allowing any military vessels, either Russian or NATO, into the Black Sea. So Turkey's done pretty well, and I think in the South Caucasus, I think they also have ambitions, but I think they're very much tied up with seeing Azerbaijan as their ally. They've kind of reversed, to my mind, very regrettably, this policy of telling the Armenians that they don't really have to do very much in order for them to normalize relations with Armenia and open the border. Now they're talking very tough, and Armenians have pretty much done everything from their side to normalize relations, but Turkey's basically saying, no, we're just going to wait for the say-so, for the green light from Azerbaijan. So I think Turkey, what we're seeing is Turkey has these ambitions, but I think they're kind of playing with the Russians in a way they didn't used to. There seems to be kind of a lot of diplomatic traffic between Ankara and Moscow, which includes the Caucasus, and they don't agree on much, but they do seem to agree on the idea that we are going to be the big regional neighbors, and the West should be cut down to size in the region. So all of which is good news for Azerbaijan, not good news for the Armenians, and not good for the EU and the US in that region.
But the Russians are sort of very adept at this, because they managed to simultaneously arm, ally, and stroke both the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis in the middle of a war, and lend peacekeepers to it. I mean, this is a balancing act of breathtaking hypocrisy.
But now, since the Ukraine war, they've really had to do an about face, and for them, when President Aliyev was in Moscow at the beginning of last week, it was all about north-south connectivity. It was all about building up Azerbaijani railways to take Russian cargo. It was all about Russia, because all its routes to the west obviously are blocked, needs to have extra capacity, extra infrastructure to trade with the South and the East. And when you're looking at that calculus, suddenly a small peacekeeping force in Karabakh is less important. It's much important to be doing deals with the most important country, both economically and geographically in the region, which is Azerbaijan.
Whatever happens to the Orthodox space?
Yes, I'm afraid money is the answer to most of these questions nowadays, rather than Orthodox solidarity.
Yes, I wonder whether the patriarch in Moscow is taking account of all of this in his sermons. Tinatin, do you want to?
Sorry, Ian, you froze up for a second, but I think you asked me if I wanted to add anything.
Indeed, I did.
I think we need to also bear in mind, why is Azerbaijan doing what it's doing in terms of dragging its feet when it comes to peace deal, which is precisely why what Tom just described is exactly what plays straight into Aliyev's hand. So why would he be in any rush to sign a deal? Which, even when we talk about the deal, I'm always very cognizant of the fact that on the one hand, we should by no means be thinking about it as a comprehensive one, right? So this will probably be, if and when it's signed, it will be more of a roadmap, I believe, and Tom may disagree, but it's going to be more of a roadmap of how do we continue having these conversations. I'm very glad to see that they were able to reach some sort of an agreement on the borders, but that is just one of many other components. And we have reason to believe that Azerbaijan will continue to pressure Yerevan in terms of trying to get as many concessions as possible, further weaken Pashinyan's negotiating position, and also essentially try to get as much as they can, not just the uncontested, but also the contested parts that they want to get their hands on. And of course, Aliyev was emboldened both in terms of the domestic applause that he got for getting Karabakh, but also in terms of lack of an appropriate response from the West. Not many of us, I don't believe, anticipated any serious sanctions vis-a-vis the September events, definitely not economic ones, not any sort of crippling economic sanctions for all the reasons that Tom just described. There is quite a lot for the West, and specifically in this case for the European Union to gain. So they're not necessarily going to be in any rush to burn any bridges there for humanitarian purposes. Yes, they're very sad for what happened to the ethnic Armenians that were forced to flee Nagorno-Karabakh, but when they have to actually be pragmatic, in light of Western sanctions on Russian energy, of course, they're going to choose energy, and money talks. And it talks very loudly in this instance. So if for the time being, and I really hope, and I believe that Aliyev will not necessarily be in any rush to roll tanks into Armenia proper, because then he's going to potentially kill off this opportunity that he has right now to be able to maximize his gains at very, very little cost. So what's in it for him other than threatening for the sake of pressuring and getting as much from Pashinyan as he possibly can and then some? There is the Zangezur corridor question, the so-called Zangezur corridor question here. But even that, I think, when the time comes, he would be able to get the concessions that he needs without necessarily having to roll in actual tanks. It's a tail risk, but I don't think that it's a tail risk that is screaming at the moment. And Tom may disagree, and I would be very interested to hear his thoughts on this as well.
Tom, are you going to disagree?
Well, I'm a bit more worried than I think that's a very good summary, Tinatin. I'm a bit more worried about this. So this is where you need a map, the so-called Zangezur corridor. Anyone watching? This is the Stalinist geography you were referring to earlier, Ian. That in 1921, there was Azerbaijan was kind of a new Soviet Azerbaijan was created, a kind of mainland Azerbaijan and an exclave, a little kind of Alaska in geography, if nothing else, which was Nakhchivan, this little bit of Azerbaijan bordering Turkey, but separated by Armenian territory. Didn't mean so much in Soviet times when all the borders were open, but then obviously when the Karabakh War broke out in the late 1980s, the road and rail connections were cut down. So Nakhchivan was cut off. Armenia was, and so you had Armenia was sort of cut off from Azerbaijan. Nakhchivan was cut off from the rest of Azerbaijan as well. And so what we're talking about is something very logical everyone wants, is to rebuild those road and rail connections across Armenia to connect the two parts of Azerbaijan. That makes a lot of sense. The trouble is they spent the last 3 years not agreeing on the modalities of this, who's going to be in control of these road and rail routes. And it always seems to come back to the Russian interest. The Russians are very interested in having control of this so-called, and this is the so-called Zangezur corridor. They've got border guards on the ground already. The Armenians, who've had this breakdown in relations with Russia, would really like the Russians out, but the Russians are already there, and the Azerbaijanis seem to be doing a deal with Moscow to insist on the Russians
what
should
cap
be guarding
badges
this.
are the Russians using in that?
Sorry, what
cap badges are the Russian border guards using? Are they peacekeepers, inviters?
Well, no, I mean, they're there officially as border guards, but then there's this trilateral agreement from 2020, which Pashinyan signed reluctantly, saying that the Russian border guards would be in control of this corridor. Now, just the last thing to say here is that if the Russians and the Azerbaijanis do get control of this and the Armenians lose control of this bit of their country with this so-called corridor, you suddenly have, and they build a railway, there's suddenly a railway there which goes all the way down, as it did in Soviet times, from Russia through Azerbaijan, through a little bit of Armenia to Nakhchivan, which is also Azerbaijan, and this little station called Julfa, which is the border railway junction with Iran. And this was the railway junction which in the Second World War, huge amounts of American Lend-Lease aid would go through this from Iran up through the Caucasus into Russia to supply the Soviet war effort. And, memories are long in Russia. This is what they would like to do. Again, have a nice rail control we're worried about the so-called Zangezur.
One of the issues that comes up here is the importance of legality and international order, in a sense. I mean, I know it's looked like a total oxymoron over the last few years of disastrous incursions and annexations, but I think people miss that there's been a certain, how should we say, respect. Is that Nagorno-Karabakh, everybody recognized that Nagorno-Karabakh was Azerbaijani officially. So there wasn't the indignation that you'd expect at the annexation. And, similarly, everyone accepts that Nakhchivan is part of Azerbaijan. So the Armenians can't get away with saying, no, it's ours. It's we found it on the roadside. And so you do have this residual respect for international law and order and boundaries, except in the case of where Putin challenged it in the Ukraine, of course. In the others, they never challenged the boundaries. They just said that we don't, not very important. So can you comment on just how much international law and respect for it played a part in the management of the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict? Thomas?
So I was offline for a minute there. I don't know if that's directed at me, Ian, or at...
Well, it is, yes. I was talking about how residual respect for international order, that Nagorno-Karabakh was always internationally accepted as part of Azerbaijan. Might be autonomous. So there was much less indignation about the annexation and, should we call it, ethnic cleansing of the Armenians from there than there would have been if it had been internationally recognized as part of Armenia. And there's similar protections for Nakhchivan and the other enclaves.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is the kind of last laugh of the Bolsheviks is that they drew these very complex boundaries within and borders within the Soviet Union, and then nowadays, because suddenly all these Union republics became independent, everyone is trying to figure out which maps to use, where, and 100 meters there, 100 meters here, and trying to follow the Bolsheviks as closely as possible, simply because there's no other maps to follow, and you've got to start somewhere. And that obviously meant that Nagorno-Karabakh, which has had hundreds of years of Armenian history, was internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. It's kind of more Armenian in many ways than Yerevan, but that's the way that the world order turned out, and therefore, there's less indignation when Azerbaijan takes that back over as they had in Soviet times. I think the point about this so-called Zangezur corridor is that Zangezur is part of Armenia. So, in order to have a road and rail route, you need the two countries working together. And this is Armenian sovereign territory. And this is where it gets tricky, because there's a kind of Azerbaijani Russian agenda for the Armenians to have as little control over this route as possible. And there's now Armenian agenda, which is now a Western agenda as well, to defend Armenian sovereignty and to get the Russians out. So suddenly this is the flashpoint.
And we have the Danzig corridor, an historic example, and we have the corridor between Königsberg, East Prussia, and the rest of Russia. There's a lot of potential here.
Well, that actually still works quite well despite the Ukraine war. I mean, there isn't, the fact that despite the fact that we're almost, NATO's at war with Russia, there's still a Russian, rail traffic runs across a NATO country, Lithuania, to go to Kaliningrad / Königsberg. So it is possible to do a deal. But, they haven't got there yet.
If I may just add something to what Tom was saying, and going back to the so-called peace deal, and I say so-called for reasons that I described earlier, that it's not necessarily a comprehensive deal that is going to bring peace to the sub-region and between these two countries either. I think it's really worth underscoring the fact that even though the deal may get signed within the foreseeable future, and I think something will probably get signed, and again, Tom may disagree here, but I think they're going to have something on paper. It's not going to mean very much, and certainly it's not going to be a binary issue whereby just because a peace deal is signed that there's going to be peace between the two countries in the South Caucasus more broadly, and that is something that I've seen many analysts and certainly journalists, try to put in the same box and say that, once this deal is signed, then this will somehow deter Azerbaijan from wanting to incurse into Armenia, into sovereign Armenian territory. And I really don't believe that that is the case. We have seen this over and over, not just vis-a-vis Azerbaijan or Armenia, but in other cases. There may be a deal, there may even be ceasefires in other cases, and is that really a deterrent? So one is not necessarily going to be an impediment or a deterrent from the other happening. I think it's going to be more of a band-aid. And I always think about this peace deal that the two sides are trying to negotiate as very much something that essentially continues the conversation, perhaps with other mediators in the room, although Baku is less and less inclined to do that. They want to talk directly to Yerevan, and that makes sense because Yerevan is in a weaker position, particularly with Pashinyan being in an increasingly weakened position at home and on his own turf. So Baku and Aliyev in particular will try to make the most of it, and who knows what will happen in Armenia come next year, come the next elections, and what if there are snap elections? So a lot could change, and that is why I think we're seeing this increased effort on Aliyev's part to try to maximize his gains while he can, and while Armenia is so weak, and while it's still in a bit of a no man's land. Yes, there is increased support from the West, of course, but we're not necessarily going to see anything very concrete that will affect Pashinyan's position vis-a-vis its efforts to increase its ties with Western backers, because still and for the foreseeable future, I believe Armenia will continue to economically, above all else, have to rely on Moscow, whether it wants to or not. So in this no man's land, it's very convenient for Azerbaijan to probe at the specific weaknesses. If anyone knows where the weak points are, it's Aliyev.
Almost mentioned the railway connection to Iran, of course, and the Iranians were playing there. We haven't mentioned yet. Do the Iranians have a dog in this fight, and how sharp are its teeth?
They do. Iran, I think, wants several things at once. It may not get them. It wants to support Armenia, wants to hedge with Armenia a bit against Azerbaijan and Turkey, because it doesn't like being surrounded by these big Turkic powers to the north. It wants its connections with Russia. That relationship's obviously got a lot stronger since the Ukraine war started. And it also doesn't, I think, want the West so much in the South Caucasus at the same time. So all those things going on with Iran. And they also have this funny relationship with Azerbaijan, where they're kind of really frenemies. They really have a very adversarial relationship, and then suddenly the next moment they're talking about infrastructure projects together. There's this, I think it's worth mentioning, there's this kind of regional format being invented called 3+3, which is Iran, Russia, and Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Now it's actually 3+2, because the Georgians don't want to be part of it, because they don't want to be in the same room as the Russians. The Armenians actually don't really want to be in there either. It's kind of 3+1+1. It's Azerbaijan loves this format because it manages.
This is quantum politics. So the Georgian dream,
neighbors quite well.
The Georgian dream, which is pro-Russian, does not want to be in the same room as the Russians. But the Iranians,
well, I mean, Georgian Russia don't have
with the Christians rather than Muslims. None of the traditional binaries apply here, do they?
They don't. Well, I mean, Georgian Dream likes informal relations with Russia, but they don't want any formal relations with Russia. They like Russian money, they like Russian cultural values, but they don't want to be any formal relationship with Russia. Russia and Georgia don't have any diplomatic relations, remember. So when people tell you that Georgian Dream is a pro-Russian party, you should also point out to them that Georgian Dream is supposedly supporting a country with which they don't have any diplomatic relations. Anyway, so there's 3+3 format. It seems to be a kind of deja vu back to kind of early 1900s, when the three regional powers, decided everything. There was no multilateral order. There was no UN. There was no EU. There was no US in the Caucasus. And that seems to be what these three countries aspire to. But it's certainly not what young Georgians, Armenians, and I think young Azerbaijanis too want, which is, forget about democracy. It's all about the big.
Well, I'm looking in the chat, and where are you all? We've touched on so many different facets. I'm sure I was hoping we'd have stricken some sparks with someone out there, or are you just so bowled over with these factoids? It's like a pointillist picture, isn't it? Lots of little facts, seemingly disconnected, which together make a picture. I mean, I had not appreciated the Georgians not having diplomatic relations with Russia. So every time I see pro-Russian Georgian dream, that will now appear in my mind as well, to like Schrodinger's cat, dead or alive, pro or anti. We have a question. How did the guests analyze the Armenian government's strategy vis-a-vis Azerbaijan? Tinatin mentioned that a delimited border with Azerbaijan won't guarantee security, but this is what the Armenian government repeatedly stresses. True or false? Tinatin, do you want to tilt?
Sure. I mean, it's not a question of true or false, but whose truth or whose
Of
sort of
course.
non-truth are we talking about, right? So Pashinyan is doing what I believe at the moment, whatever he can to stay in power. And he's getting a lot of pushback at home. So the protests that we're seeing, and I think they're going to probably escalate over time, depending on any other concessions that he gives to the Azeri side, in terms of giving up more and more territory. But he did stress that the alternative to not agreeing to give control of the 4 villages that many of those from Tavush region are actually marching on in opposition to this move, then the alternative was going to be war. And that's what he said. I think to a degree he may have potentially been exaggerating it a bit at the time. And by no means am I trying to diminish or try to minimize in any way the risk that we're looking at in terms of a military escalation. But in terms of at the time when he made that statement, I don't know if there were necessarily any tanks to be seen from outside of his window. That said, I wasn't there, so I can't really tell you what it was exactly that he was seeing or the warnings that he may have received from, sort of immediate connections to Aliyev. But that said, by the same token, I think the Armenian government strategy vis-a-vis Azerbaijan does not always reflect the Armenian people's strategy. And I think there are also those within Yerevan that have fled Nagorno-Karabakh, the ethnic Armenians, that feel very, very strongly about what happened in September. And in some ways, and I think Tom actually stressed this point earlier, that to a degree, the ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh that have since fled were, I think, to some degree more Armenian than those that may be in Yerevan today. So it's very difficult for us to necessarily say that there is any sort of a binary situation in terms of, what the Armenian government strategy is and what the people's strategy is. I think sometimes they overlap and other times they do not, which is why we're seeing this increased pushback against Pashinyan and the decisions that he is making, but arguably there aren't a whole lot of options at his disposal at the moment.
But being in government,
if I could just jump in for a moment.
Sorry, Tom.
I think I would actually disagree a bit with you here, Tinatin. I think Pashinyan's a bit more comfortable, in the sense that, I think he's made a lot of mistakes. I think people are critical of him, but I think the criticism is coming from the diaspora, which is still mourning the loss of Karabakh, mourning its dreams of a kind of greater Armenia in some senses, whereas he's very, very firm that we just focus on the future and development of Armenia within its recognized borders. There is obviously local protests from the villages which have been around the villages which have been given up. The villages which actually have been given up are actually empty, but neighbors of those villages are obviously worried because Azerbaijanis are going to be moving in next door. But I think there's no, talking of opposition, the opposition in Armenia is even weaker than that in Georgia. There's no credible opposition. The main opposition is former officials who were completely discredited, who no one wants to see back. No new force has emerged. So I think by default, Pashinyan, is still the least unpopular, shall we put it that way, leader in Armenia.
I will just very quickly jump in just to stress something that Tom said, and I agree completely. So when I said opposition, I was talking about opposition to what happened as opposed to an actual opposition party. And if we think that the opposition in Georgia is weak in terms of political parties that are in opposition to GD, there is at this point no one, and I think in Armenia, that could actually be a viable candidate that would be palatable for not just the majority, but I think probably for all of the population at this rate, and also one that would be good for Moscow. The candidates that Moscow would be happier with, there is no way, of course, that they could get any traction in Armenia at this time. So for Moscow also, Pashinyan may be something of a convenient figure. He's better than some others if they were there. Certainly not as good as the ones that Moscow would be able to stand up to support from Moscow that would actually go in to Armenia. But again, they have to be realistic and understand that these are the cards that they've been dealt, and they're as good as they're going to get. And he is, I think, what I was trying to get at is in terms of his weakness, in terms of negotiating weakness that we're seeing, but given the fact that there isn't anyone that could take his seat, or even if a seat were vacant tomorrow, that is going to keep him there for the time being, and maybe for the foreseeable future. But again, a lot could happen between now and the elections in 2025. And of course, what happens vis-a-vis Russia versus the West when it comes to Armenia's tilt toward Europe.
One of the issues that you point on with the expatriates is the importance. I mean, for well over a century, the Armenian diaspora has played a somewhat hyperactive and not necessarily constructive role with terrorism, bombs, and other ways of expressing their dissatisfaction at the loss of the Armenian homelands in Anatolia. This is also played into geopolitics because the Armenian lobby and the Greek lobby and the Israeli lobby and others have been dancing around in Washington, pushing and pulling on various things. Does this have any knock-on effect? For example, the Israeli assault on the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem. Does this just reflect in a larger picture?
I mean, obviously, when we talk about the Armenian diaspora, it's huge and it's incredibly diverse. It's worldwide. I don't think it's obviously, it's a multiple. So sometimes when we say the Armenian diaspora, what we're doing is a shorthand for some rather politicized organizations in Washington, D.C. and L.A., which are, quite nationalist, quite strident on issues. But there are different, many different Armenian diasporas. I mean, what they have in common is that they were all descendants of people who were, who fled or were victims of the genocide of 1915. So they come from what's now Eastern Turkey, and they're very shaped by that experience, that trauma, and also years of Turkish denial of what happened to their grandparents. If Turkey was to acknowledge what had happened, then suddenly then everyone could move on more than a century later. Well, most people could move on, but that's unfortunately not the case. We're still stuck in this kind of with everyone still imprisoned by that history. And of course, those people also projected their hopes and fears onto Armenia, often in very unhelpful ways. They invested heavily in the cause of the Karabakh Armenians, kind of encouraging them to fight against Azerbaijan in ways which were, as we can now see, pretty unhelpful. This kind of no compromise message that that the Karabakh Armenians were getting, really meant that there were diplomatic openings which weren't taken, and I think Armenian diaspora people certainly played a role in that. A lot of them are now very, very critical of the Pashinyan government in Armenia, and they need to be reminded Armenia is a democracy. Pashinyan is an elected official. You are chose. If you want to live in Armenia, you should come into Armenia and vote. But to write newspaper columns condemning Pashinyan as a criminal is not really very helpful if you want to be a kind of patriotic Armenian.
Votes in Yerevan rather than checkbooks in LA. It's a very sensible point, but it's foreign lobbies don't always take. Well, got to come towards the end now. I'm fascinating discussion, which I've learned a lot. I hope other people have seen new angles. It's like it's opening the box and finding Schroeder's cat is alive, dead, and shrieking at the same time. So it seems to be lashing out in all directions. Thank you very much from the Foreign Press Association in New York. Our next webinar is the 23rd of May, when we have Abby Williams, no relation, who was the Chief of Planning and Strategy for Kofi Annan, to discuss the United Nations and leadership in relation to his latest book, which is on Kofi Annan, who you might remember a few years ago, we had hopes in the UN, we had the responsibility to protect and all sorts of UN initiatives. And there's been a sort of singular lack of charisma. And I'm hoping that we'll discuss this with Abby when he comes on the 23rd. So in the meantime, thanks very much, Tom, for your expertise and urbanity as we just rove over these issues. Thank you. As always, Tinatin, I love your imperial purple. You know, you look like you're rehearsing for the Empress Theodora.
I was rehearsing for Putin's inauguration that I did not get an invite to go to.
Shame.
Thank you very much. This was a pleasure.
Those are good. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. And
thank you so much.
See you soon, I hope.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.